Hey, what's up everybody? Welcome to Rules of Engagement. Today's episode is going to be developing fundamentals, but first let's talk a little bit about what this show is all about. So this is a new show hosted by MLG, put on by MLG, hosted by yours truly, myself, Nick Axlav-Ranish, and here we're going to do a lot of breakdown on StarCraft strategy. We're going to have basically a new episode every single day of the week, Monday through Thursday, each episode with a different theme on. We take out a look at what some of those themes are right now. Every Monday, we have Talking Tactics. This episode is where we look at pro games, and we analyze the tactics they use, and we look at what were the tactics they used that basically provided them the victory. And those tactics are something that's easier for you to emulate at home, not just microing like crazy, macroing like crazy. What basic military principles are key to victory in StarCraft. Tuesday is today we're going to do developing fundamentals, and today we're basically going to be looking at building up the fundamentals of the game from the ground up. So we're going to start with, economy basics, micro basics, build order concepts, and these fundamentals are something that's extremely valuable to someone who's never really played a competitive game of StarCraft, a multiplayer game of StarCraft where they jump in, it's just them versus one opponent. But it can also be useful for you guys who've been playing for a little while and you've kind of hit a wall, and you don't know why you're stuck in Gold, Diamond, Master, whatever league you're stuck in. Maybe it's because there's some basic fundamentals that you're missing out. So tune into this show. It'll help you out. And, of course, remind all your friends who ask you, why do you play StarCraft? Tell them to tune on to the Fundamentals show, and they can see how complex and beautiful of a game it truly is. Wednesday, we have Mechanics of the Bizarre. That's where you get to look at professional level games, but these games are going to be where the pros do something a little bit crazy, a little bit something off the wall, and we're going to look at those games and say, why aren't these builds being used all the time? Why was it cool to use it there? And maybe are these the builds of the future, or are they just going to be ones that are thrown in to catch your opponents off guard every once in a while? Thursday, we're going to do Community Choice. This is your guys' chance at home to get your replays analyzed and looked at by myself. If you ever have a game you want to throw up on the show, you don't know why you lost it, you just want to brag how you beat your friend over at the next door or something like that, send in those replays to majorleaguegaming.com/replays. There's a little submission form. It's quite painless, takes about maybe 20 to 30 seconds to fill out. Shoot that replay over to me and we'll air it on Thursday. Also a reminder, at the end of every episode we have a question and answer segment. Tweet at me your questions about life, about StarCraft, about whatever you want to tweet at, strategy, anything, to ISAxlav. Tweet me those at the end of every episode. We'll do a Q&A segment. But let's actually get into today's episode and talk about what we're going to be going over today. So if you missed last week's Developing Fundamentals episode, this is going to be a little bit of a continuation. It's going to be, they're all standalone parts, so it's not like you won't be able to understand this. It's all still fundamentals, but it's a little bit of a more slightly advanced fundamental. So if you feel it's a little overhead, or if you want to catch up on some of the basics, go catch up with last episode's VOD, MLG.tv. You can find all the VODs there. But today we're going to go to Economy Basics Part 2, talking about how to make macro easier. Last week we talked about basically how mining minerals works and how fast you can mine it, how many production buildings to get, and so forth. Now we're going to talk about how making the task of controlling all that advanced economy a little bit easier for you. Then we're going to go into Micro Concepts Part 2. Before we're talking about how to maximize your unit effectiveness, now we're going to be talking about how to maximize your army effectiveness. Then we're going to go into the Build Order Concepts Part 2. Before we talk about how to do a timing build, now we're going to talk about how you can understand a build that's designed around a unit composition, heading more for the late game. And then, of course, we're going to end this segment with a question and answer period. That's where you can submit your questions to me at ISAxlav, and we'll get to those at the end of the episode. But let's actually jump right into Economy Basics Part 2. We're going to talk about, there's a couple things about making your macro better. There's a couple small details. The first one is basically we're going to look at when should you be expanding. The next thing we're going to look at is when should you be how to handle your supply, and then of course the last we're going to do tricks to improve your macro. So I just made a little bit of a game here, just myself versus an AI. We're just going to watch this through my viewpoint with the production tab up, and then we're going to walk over here and we can look at it on the big screen here. Just going to scale. It shouldn't be scaling through my viewpoint. Let me make sure. There we go. Okay, up to my view. So the first question is, when should you expand, right? This is the question. The important part here is you should basically expand as soon as you can. From a purely economic perspective, you want to non-stop build workers. That's the most important thing. Non-stop build workers. And then build supply depots every time you get a chance to build them. As soon as you have extra money that's not being spent on supply depots or workers, You want to expand as soon as you have the money to afford it. That's the most important thing. So you can see here, I'm going to be getting my first supply depot there. That's because my supply is at 10 out of 11, and I need to get that finished in order to produce more SCVs. But then as soon as I have enough money, while I'm maintaining constant SCV production, I'm going to be getting that expansion. The next thing we want to talk about is going to be how to handle keeping up with supply, right? I just mentioned the most important thing to maintain your economy is going to be to have constant SCV production. Of course, you can't have constant SCV production unless you have supply to handle it. So one thing, as we look through this game, I'm going to lay down a couple basic rules for you guys, right? The first rule is, if your supply is less than 100, right? Right here it's 13. That's pretty small. At the start of the game, you're going to be less than 100, right? If your supply is less than 100, what you want your supply to do is you want the gap in your supply there. Oh, it looks like I accidentally moved off. Oh, there we go. Sorry. You want the gap in your supply there. Right now it's 5. That gap should be greater than or equal to your production. So if your supply is less than 100, you want your gap, supply gap, I'm going to have to shorthand things here a little bit, to be greater than production. We're just going to put PR. That stands for production. So your production, if you want to know what that is, you can look at the production tab. Okay? Right now, there's nothing in production except for a command center. That's not a unit. We're talking about unit constructing things. The only units I can build right now are SCVs. Okay? So there's a couple rules about the way to match supply to production. If you have a barracks producing Marines, that's 1 food per production cycle. If you have a barracks producing Marauders, that's 2 food per production cycle. A command center building SCVs is a unique case, right? SCVs build so quickly that you actually count them double for supply. So in terms of treating your food gap, treat each command center as needing 2 supply within the gap to maintain production. So basically you can add up all the units you're building at once. Let's say you have 3 barracks all building Marines. That's 3. You had, let's say you have 2 command centers. Right now my second command center is about to finish. Each of those is worth 2. That would be 7. So your supply gap should be 7. That's what's equal to your production. The one time this will start changing is because that starts getting harder and harder to do the math, right? I mean, it's easy when you have 3 barracks and 2 command centers, right? Each time you had a barracks, you just need to make sure your gap is 1 higher than it was before. When it gets hard is when you're getting like 10 barracks, 3 factories, 4 command centers, and 6 starports or something crazy like that, right? You get to late game. So as soon as your supply is greater than 100, right? Instead of worrying about your production, just make it so that your gap should just be exactly equal to 30. So that's the other rule. Is once it gets to late game and you don't have to worry about this crazy production or anything like that, you're trying to add up all your production facilities, just make sure your gap is equal to 30 supply. So early on, it's equal to your production. So why don't we count my production right now so we can see how this is done, right? So right now I've got 3 Marines being built at a time, right? Sorry, let me step away a little bit so you can see the production tab. 3 Marines being built at a time, and then 2 SCVs. The SCVs, remember, they count double because they build so fast. So that's 4 food for the 2 command centers, 3 food for the 3 Marine production. That means I want a gap of 7 food. Right here we can see 38 over 38. That's not quite 7 food. So not quite doing things correctly there immediately. I had to supply deal with just a hair late. And you want to always keep that at 7 food. So if it's less than 7 food, I should be building a supply depot. If we look at the production tab, there's a supply depot being built. When you watch your replays, if your supply gap does not fit this quotient of making sure you can fit a production cycle per supply gap, there needs to be at least 1 supply depot in production, if not 2 or 3. And then, of course, later in the game, you need to make sure that gap is 30 supply. So this is basically how to handle your supply. Now we're going to look at some tricks to improve your macro. So we're going to jump back onto the computer here. And one of the most important tricks is to shift queue workers. You can get right back in the game. The importance of shift queuing workers is pretty important. So let's see if we can find a section where we do that. Every time I build, let me take off my camera. Every time I build let's say a supply depot, right, or a building, the most important thing to do here, I'll pause the next time I get to that point, is that you queue them up. Okay, so right here, this is important right here. There's 2 ways to build a building. One is you grab your SCV, right? You select your SCV, you hit the build command, and then you hit build supply depot, and you throw it down somewhere, okay? And then the depot's done, SCV sits there, and then you've got to grab that SCV and tell them to do another task. Now, building that supply depot has taken basically 2 separate instances of your attention. It took the instance to go ahead and go build it, then also when it finished, you had to re-put your attention there to put that SCV back to work. So instead, with these SCVs, actually I need to back up 10 seconds here so we can see the actual command. Let's get to when I build the SCV command. We're going to see exactly how I do it. Fast forward just a hair here. And boom. All right, so do you see the SCV? If you click on each SCV, do you see this green trail here, right? Click on this SCV, you see the green trail here. What that means is instead of just telling it to build a supply depot, what I did is I selected the SCV, I held down the shift key, and then I told it to build a supply depot, then I right-clicked back towards minerals. What the shift key does is it queues up commands, so you can go ahead and it'll build a depot, and then the instant the SCV is done building depot, it'll go back to mining minerals. It's much, much more efficient to shift queues after building structures, to shift queue workers. I basically tell them to go back to mining minerals as soon as they're done. So that's one big trick to improve macro. The other important part is learning about control groups. This is something most people who have played around with the game a little bit or watch the tooltips know. We're going to go over it very briefly. So if you notice here at the bottom, I have control groups. So as soon as I hit the 0 key, you see what happened there? All my barracks were selected. As soon as I hit the 4 key, yeah, it should be 4 key. I guess this keyboard doesn't quite work. Replay is a little bit funny, but you queue up your orbital commands to, or your command centers to a different control group. So you can hit 0, it gets to the barracks, you hit a different key, and it'll go to the command centers. But the idea here is that this way you can macro without having to go through and systematically build every single building. So let's say you didn't have the control group, right? You have to select your barracks, you'd have to hit the A key to build the marine, you have to select the next barracks, hit the A key, etc. And your whole time your screen's over here. If you're having the control groups, you can be having your screen looking out for potential attacks. While your screen's here, you don't even move it. You hit the 0 key, all of a sudden the barracks are selected, hit the A button a couple times, and then you're good to go. And then the last trick we're going to talk about is how to group macro tasks, right? So this whole episode has been telling you about various macro tasks you're supposed to be doing. One of the most important macro tasks I mentioned is continually building SCVs. Another one I just went over is how to build supply depots when you should be building them. Then, of course, the last macro task is going to be building units out of those production facilities. So I'm going to give you a couple examples. We're going to rewind this replay back to a little bit around here. And there's multiple ways to be going through this process. So if you look here, let's say right now I want to do a macro cycle, right? And I'm going to do it actually, let me fast forward just a little bit more, get to my viewpoint so we can see exactly what's happening. Player camera. Okay, here we are. So at this point, I just finished one macro cycle, right? And now there's multiple ways to go about the next macro cycle, right? Let's say you have to like micro out your front. You're busy watching a marine. So you got this marine, you're fighting a battle, blah, 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 blah. All of a sudden you're like, oh no, I need to go back and macro. So you go back, you build the barracks. You go back, you build the SCV. You go back and you build the depots, right? And this whole process took about 10 to 12 seconds. And then 10 to 12 seconds can actually be quite a long time as far as StarCraft 2 goes. There's a much more efficient way to do it, and it's to do all the tasks at once instead of thinking of them linearly. If you're thinking of them linearly, your brain will have to do a task, then there'll be a pause where your brain tries to figure out what you should be doing next, and then you'll do that task, and there's all this thinking involved. Whereas we're going to pause it right here. So again, you're going to be up at the front. But this time, instead of saying, oh, I need to build SCVs, and then a second later, oh, I have to build Marines too. And then a second later, oh, I should build some supply depots, right? This time you're going to think, okay, I'm busy, microing my Marines, I'm fighting him. I need to jump back and do my macro. You're going to just think of it all in one, you're going to group it all in one total thought. And you need to train your brain this way as you play more and more StarCraft. So your macro is going to be those 3 things combined. Worker production, unit production, and then, of course, building supply depots. So if you think of them in one set, right, you can do them much faster because what you're going to do is you're going to use the hotkeys, and you're going to build all your stuff. You're going to build Marines in the barracks hotkey. You can build SCVs and command center hotkey. Then you're going to go build depots. And it's not going to be even a second delay between the ending of one of these actions and the beginning of the next action. It's supposed to be a very smooth transition between all your macro actions. And if you do that well, you can get this macro cycle. The pros can do it in 1 or 2 seconds. You're not going to be nearly as fast with your hands, but you should be able to get this whole cycle down to about 5 to 6 game seconds. And then this is a cycle you're going to be doing once or twice a minute. And then if you can get this down to 5 to 6 seconds, maybe twice a minute, say that's 10 to 12 seconds, that means you have 48 seconds out of the minute to do all your micro and all your fun tactical stuff. You can run around your banshees, etc. But just remember to always save that 10 seconds for macro, and that's a much more benefit than trying to just intersperse it throughout your play. And then you're going to be spending most of your time just trying to handle your economy instead of just devoting a specific block out of each minute to that time. So I hope you guys enjoyed this segment on developing fundamentals. Let's do a quick recap on what we went over. We're going to look at, first, we talked about when to expand as soon as you get the money to do so. People are going to say, well, what if they rush me and I die? Well, in that case, look at the replay, and then you can tune it back from there. But as you're starting out, expand as soon as possible. Worry about how to get defenses later in the game. Like each time you lose to a rush, jump back into replay and think to yourself, how many units that I need at that time to survive that rush? And then you can dial back your economically focused openings slightly from there. But it's always best to start out expanding as greedily as possible for learning purposes. The next thing is how to handle supply, right? Remember the 2 rules. Make sure the gap between your available supply and your currently used supply is greater than or equal to your total amount of supply you produce out of each production cycle. And then once you're into the late game, just make sure that gap is always at least talked about was basically tricks to improve macro. So remember, the couple tricks are use control groups for your production cycles, shift queue workers when they build buildings, and then lastly, try to group all your macro actions into one thought in your brain so it takes less of your brain power to maintain your economy throughout the game. We're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to get on to our next segment, which is going to be Micro Basics Part 2.